Hi, everybody. This is Marky Billson, host of Tri-City Sports Now on 1420 NBC Sports Radio Tri-Cities. A legend has retired. This is Media Watch. Well, the legend I'm speaking of is Don Imus, who, to tell you the truth, I started listening to probably about 24 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, the promos on WFAN and such. But about 24 years ago, Don Imus was carried locally, maybe even a little bit before then. He was carried locally here in the Tri-Cities. And boy, did I think, thank goodness, because in the Tri-Cities, radio can be, except for my show, of course, pretty damned boring. I'm not going to put it any other way. It's very milquetoast, very don't upset the apple cart, very don't say anything negative about anything locally, except on my show, of course, where I will rejoice in telling you the truth. And that's what makes my sports talk show a little bit different than, say, others who have been known to, for instance, lead off and talk 19 minutes to begin the show talking about their son's Little League football game. Not making that up. But when Imus came in, I knew he was Howard Stern's rival. I had listened to the promos on WFAN when I listened to WFAN overnight, listening to Steve Summers and the like, and loved the promos that you would hear on there. Funny now that I can recall one that was about a young kid who seemed to have a crush on, not Ivanka Trump, but Ivanka Trump's mother. Ivanka Trump wasn't old enough, probably for the young boy who called in he was, but there was another one that I can remember where they were talking about giving away bobblehead dolls in WFAN, and the promo went something like this: other stations give away cash, trip to Tahiti. Know what we got? Bobblehead dolls, which, to tell you the truth, was probably a better promo than cash or the trip to Tahiti, since the odds of winning those are quite long, but getting in a bobblehead doll, well, hey, that is something you can get. And without a whole lot of, waiting around too long on the line for it. At least we hope so. It is New York City. There's more competition to be the seventh caller, I guess. Anyway, but like I said, when he finally came in, I thought, great, creativity. Maybe because I'm in my 20s at the time, a little bit of shock, which we could have used at the time. Some spice instead of the milquetoast, like I said, that we had in the area, because there is a whole lot more to radio than good day to you. And I'd like to think that I'm somebody who realizes that and preaches that on my show. Now, I didn't know he had changed his show, Don Imus, to politics, but I liked the fact he was hard-hitting. I was working there at the time. I remember listening to Imus, and he called someone, one of his staff who had made a mistake on the air, an idiot. And the thing was, I liked that. Not that I like being called an idiot or calling people idiots on a regular basis. But the fact of the matter was, it was spicy. It was something other than what we were hearing at the time in the Tri-Cities. Sour, yes. Angry, yes. But sometimes you're a little sour, you're a little angry, and frankly, Mr. Rogers, I love Mr. Rogers, but he's not what I want to hear 24/7. Imus was also the political bellwether of the nation at his peak, when he moved from being and doing the old bits like, well, let's play him again. What do you say here on Marky's Media Watch? I love Billy Saul Hargis, which was actually his most famous character, Don Imus. And it was a take on TV preachers long before Swaggart and Jim Baker. And a great story that I also have, which we'll tell another day, was when Jim Baker tried to buy my grandparents' house with no money. Didn't succeed, but he did try to do that. That's another story for another day. Anyway, Imus was calling out the TV preachers, years before anybody else was, back in the 70s. But as I was saying, he was the political bellwether of the country. You listen to Imus, and you really got the take of not what the conservatives were hoping, or the conservative pulse like a Limbaugh, or say a modern-day Rachel Maddow or Young Turks, what they're hoping for on the left, but often it just isn't the case. I mean, how often did we hear, Trump can't win, Trump can't win? That was the left being hopeful, but not reading the tea leaves. Imus could read the tea leaves. Now, he wasn't 100% with it, but he had, as I said, his finger on the pulse of the politics of the country, and it really wasn't through partisan glasses. I mean, he loved John McCain, but he endorsed Kerry in 2004, McCain in 2000, Dole in 96, see, both parties, Clinton in 92. You getting the idea here? What I'm talking about? All right, he would play even, although he was a huge McCain fan during the 2008 election, I think it was the Black Eyed Peas with a song, Yes We Can. And I thought that was, that was huge. Imus also had a huge influence on sports talk. Now, we had sports talk radio long before WFAN debuted 24/7 with the format on AM 1090, which was the former frequency, by the way, of the Brooklyn Dodgers on WHN. Yeah, Billson knows his radio history. But it wasn't a big signal. I remember trying to pick up the 5,000 watt signal on my super radio long before Mark Cuban had created, internet broadcasting. But trying to, and maybe once getting Steve Summers in the middle of the night for about 3 seconds. I think I heard him once say, "Are you a Pirates fan?" to somebody. Obviously, that was going to resonate with me. But in 1988, WFAN went from 1050 to 660 AM on a 50,000 watt signal. That was huge for a few reasons. Basically, WFAN was becoming the new, are you ready for it now, WNBC. Yeah, Howard Stern's old station. They were taking over the frequency. WNBC was, they couldn't pay their bills or some such thing. And so WFAN was able to take over the frequency. But with it, they were also able to bring over Don Imus in the morning. And they were also able to be heard throughout not only the New York metropolitan area where it meant something, but throughout the country. And so I was able to listen to WFAN at night. I remember listening 1988. I don't have the date, but I remember the first night they were on the air overnight 24/7. And it was after Game 6 of the 1988 National League Championship Series, because I remember listening to Steve Summers talk about the Mets' victory over the Hollywood Dodgers. And I was rooting for the Mets at the time. So I remember that. Of course, the Dodgers win it the next day. But anyway, don't like teams that move. Yeah, 40 years and far before my time, but enforced throughout my family that you are to not like the Dodgers move from Brooklyn. I'm a traditionalist, okay? Yeah, sure. Here we go. Ken Burns didn't either. All right, but anyway, we're going with this. And just, music to my listening, talking about who's going to play in the World Series all night long was, to me at 17, about as close to heaven as you were going to get. So I would listen to WFAN until I fell asleep at night. And I got to know that WFAN had taken over not only the frequency, but a lot of the WNBC programming. Don't get it wrong. WNBC, yes, I'm doing the old tag. But they used to have a show. You hear about Imus, you hear about Stern, you hear about Soupy Sales. What don't you hear about was Dave Sims. And listening to the flagship station of, for instance, the New York Rangers. I would listen to many Rangers games on 660 AM. But Dave Sims, who's become very famous as a play-by-play broadcaster, especially nationally, doing National Football League games on the radio in today's era, he had a sports talk show that went from the early evening to about midnight, usually before and after whatever broadcast WNBC was airing. I believe they also had the Nets, I think. I don't think they had the Knicks, but I think they had the Nets. And anyway, but before and after the game, you'd have Sports Tonight with Dave Sims, and sometimes it would be a 6-hour show if they had no broadcast. And that was a forerunner to WFAN. That was sports talk. Where am I going with this and talking about Imus in the morning and bringing it on? Well, realizing what a revenue and ratings draw in the morning Imus was, WFAN said, okay, maybe we won't be 24/7 sports. Maybe in the morning we'll have Imus on doing his stuff, And this is when he chose to be political because they weren't playing records anymore. And so he always had, I mean, even if you listen to his early comedy albums, he's talking about news, this sort of thing. And eventually would get to the point where he was interviewing Bill Clinton in 92 before the New York primary, which is said to be the interview that won Clinton that primary and got him started to the White House. Anyway, I do think that Imus influenced sports talk in a negative way because for years, not until Mike and Mike on ESPN Radio, when ESPN Radio decided they were going to go 24/7, was there really a morning sports talk show. There was even a feel that, oh, you can't talk sports in the morning like that, which is, poppycock. But think about the early days of ESPN with Nation's Business Today on from 7 to 9 and not Sports Center. Remember that? Okay. So, Imus in that way, I think, hurt sports talk, but the fact that he was able to bring the revenue into WFAN for the other 19 or so hours of the day, or 20 hours, I guess he was on from 5:30 to 10. So figure that out. That would be 19 and a half hours. So he was able to bring the credibility of the listeners and the book, if you will, the overall ratings, to make the sports format flourish. Just like ESPN. I guess it started off as a loss leader. Imus was the guy that made it. And in that part, helped make 24/7 radio, a sports talk radio, which is now about the hottest format going today. Initially, WFAN actually did try to brand themselves with 24/7 sports talk. They brought in Pete Franklin from Cleveland. Pete Franklin was, before there's 24/7 sports talk, the sports talk show host in America. He was the guy that would give you the, that sort of Jim Rome snarky edge, what Mark Madden does today. He was the first one, to hang up on callers, to give them nicknames. One of his, I think it was, Sports Illustrated, who once quoted him as cutting off a caller saying, "You bore me, meathead. What'd you do? Take Tylenol for dinner?" Which 35 years later is probably meaningless to a lot of people, but at the time that actually did make sense. And if you are from the era, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that. Anyway, that was the style that Pete Franklin, very entertaining. And perhaps that also allowed Imus to fit in very well in sports talk radio because, like I said, he could be acerbic. He could call out a J.D. Hayworth, talking about sportscasters here. And I remember one time when interviewing J.D. Hayworth, Imus listened to Hayworth say, well, now, we still don't know if there's weapons of mass destructions in Iraq. And he just shot back at Hayworth, who was then a politician from Arizona. And, oh, come on, I've got better chance of finding weapons of mass destruction in my own backyard than you do in Iraq. Challenging them that way. That was great. Imus also proved to me something, and this is the first lesson of the radio business. It's about the money that you can bring in. If you can bring in the money, you can basically say whatever you want, save for Welcome to Genocide Today. If you're bringing in enough coin. As I said, Pete Franklin, when he came over to New York, he was known in Cleveland, but the New Yorkers, and he was very at a national presence because his show could be heard throughout the country at night, but people in New York had been listening to Sports Tonight. They weren't listening to Pete Franklin. And so there was a transition. It was like, who's this old cranky guy? Well, Imus was the old cranky guy that they knew and that they liked, and that had made them laugh. And as I said about the money that he brought in, one time back in the 70s, and eventually cost him his job. He actually lost his job, went back to Cleveland for a year or two, and then came back to New York in 1979, supposedly sobered up. It took him a little bit more time. But anyway, he once missed 100 days of work one year in the 70s, wasn't fired. It's because the sponsors of WNBC had paid to hear Billy Saul Hargis and Judge Hangin and all those characters, Moby Worm, whoever. I think Moby Worm came along in the 80s. I could be wrong about that. But they had paid to listen to Imus, and he was getting written up in Life magazine, all this sort of stuff, features, that sort of thing. And, okay, we'll put on Best of Imus on that day. Carson can take that many days off. Well, so can Imus, because that's who they've paid to hear. Sadly, Imus is not going to be remembered for being this great DJ or this great political commentator. He'll be remembered for his comments on the Rutgers women's basketball situation. Calling them, well, I guess I better clean this up here. If you don't know, and I think you do, even though it happened 11 years ago, he called Rutgers basketball players sleepy-headed garden utensils. That's it. Sleepy-headed garden utensils. I know it makes no sense, but I'm not going to get banned off of YouTube or Facebook or anything for what he said. You know the comment that he said. So it actually was an argument, or a statement, excuse me, that many people, when they saw it at the time of its occurrence, just blew off. It was Imus being Imus. He said that sort of stuff all the time. We are in the Tri-Cities here. That's proof there. However, it was something that also then I think really proved the power of, first, the internet, and also, if you hadn't known it by then, and I had certainly caught on to it, but a lot of other people had not, the leftward leanings of ESPN. You know, like I said, Imus called out the Rutgers basketball team for their appearance, a little bit of prodding from Bernard McGurk, who is his right-hand man on the show, and would he call him a producer? I think if I'm Bernard, if I'm giving you the wrong title, forgive me, but he in effect had many producer duties, did he? And I actually think those comments may have helped Barack Obama get elected to the presidency in 2008. As I said, Imus was a huge McCain supporter. Joe Biden in 2000, and was it 2008? No, it was 2007. Right before those comments, actually had announced his own candidacy for the presidency, not in some big press conference, not in some big rally. He announced it on the Imus in the Morning program. That shows you how big Imus was and how he had his finger on the pulse of the nation's political scene. The second inauguration of George W. Bush, who did he have on that morning? Dick Cheney. I mean, a man was very powerful. And my question is this. Would a continued strong Imus, had he not been vilified for the Rutgers comments, had he not said the Rutgers comments, would his continued boosting of John McCain for the many months he was off the air, would that have pushed McCain over and allowed him to beat Barack Obama? It's debatable. A lot of people think I'm crazy. Most of them didn't listen to Imus. But if you were in that political junkie cult, you had to listen to Imus in the morning. And again, what he said went and really was the political bellwether of the country. Now, after he made the Rutgers comments, as I said, initially people were like, oh yeah, Imus being Imus. Nobody really, picked, and then specifically ESPN, Media Matters, called him out on it. And to be honest with you, it sounded like Media Matters very leftist, a new, a young person watching, being the watchdog. And, I've got my own thoughts on this. I'm reminded of the WKRP episode where Dr. Johnny Fever said, who are these people complaining about the music that they say? Do they, sit in darkened rooms listening to our station saying, there's a naughty word? That's kind of what I think of Media Matters. In fact, take kind of off. That is what I think of Media Matters. Let's fast forward here. So they call out Imus on those comments. Media Matters at that time is a website. It's viewed by some on the left, but not the mainstream. When ESPN, which obviously caters to, or used to at least, both sides of the fence, because, hey, they're about sports, not politics, right? When they started picking up on it, because it was a comment about a women's basketball team, that's when the criticism of Imus really took off. And this shows the power of sports talk radio. Jemele Hill, we're all familiar with her. She was the one who raised the initial stink. And on ESPN radio throughout the weekend, they played up the story, what Imus had said about the Rutgers women's basketball team. Otherwise, it would have been ignored. And it showed how deadly the race card is, and now how often it can be played. But by Monday the next week, Imus was in total apologetic mode. He just wasn't himself. Imus was the guy that was, acid-tongued. He'd caustic comments that were funny. He'd bash anybody. Come on. Maybe even it would be cruel. But it was Imus being Imus. We expected it. The filter was Charles McCourt maybe going off on him, his great newsman. And that was always funny when that happened every once in a while. But now he was like a wounded animal. Instead of sticking to his guns, he was at first, apologetic and thought, I'm going to go on Al Sharpton's radio show, which was a big mistake, and apologize and it'll be forgotten about. Al Sharpton didn't want to hear anything about it. I listened to that radio show. It was, when were you going to resign? When are you going to resign? When are you going to resign? And Imus was faced to be confrontational in a bad way and defensive. After that, it was all over. He was going to get suspended. MSNBC took him off the air. Finally, he was off the air for several months, then before coming back, really weakened, no longer on WFAN, now on WABC, taking over for Curtis Sliwa, who actually would do a show. It was Curtis Sliwa had to be the hardest working man in radio. He'd do a 5 to 6 program, then would come on to Imus, and then Sliwa would do 10 to noon. How would you like that? That wasn't too good for Curtis Sliwa. Anyway, Guardian Angels, Curtis Sliwa, if you're not familiar with it. Anyway, by that time, Imus had been weakened. The show at the end was not what it once was. It would get continually, a lot of times they would have always just the best guests, the best political commentators. I spoke to you about the politicians they'd have on and such. And then it got to be more of, well, here's the weekly segment with my wife. All right. Let it be said with this, I really did respect Imus for what he did, the cattle ranch, the working cattle ranch for kids with cancer. That was, I know he talked about it all the time and all that, but I thought that was a great charity. Don Imus is going to be missed. And where he's going to be missed the most is the fact that he was the bellwether of political commentary in this country. Again, I can remember him saying, I'll bet you money John Kerry will win. Okay, didn't get that one right, but hey, nobody knew going into that election day who was going to win, right? That wasn't 92. That wasn't 88. That wasn't 96 when you knew who was going to win. Maybe even 2008. All the other ones seem to have been toss-ups. I know a lot of people thought that Hillary was a slam dunk in 2016. Obviously, it didn't turn out to be that way. But really, most of the presidential elections in this century, unlike the ones before, you didn't know going into Election Day who was going to win. Exception maybe 1960 or so. Anyway, that's what we'll miss with Imus. As well as those, just tremendous, we haven't heard the Billy Saul Hargises of the world or anything in a long, long time. But they've been around. You've been able to uncover them because Imus was on the air. The great rivalry with Howard Stern. Look, I like Howard Stern. Howard Stern, though, is a bellwether of the entertainment industry. Imus is the bellwether of the political scene. That's the great difference between the two of them. And both love the hard questions. It's what we try to do. Anyway, tip of the cap to Don Imus. For 50 years on the air, he certainly influenced me. And so in that sense, I think that the show will in some ways live on, just like people who pass away influence you by how they treated you or the influence they had on your life. Imus isn't dead. He's promising one more big thing, and I can't wait to see what it is. But again, who are we going to turn to now for that political bellwether? Because CNN, MSNBC, Limbaugh, I don't know, who's a left-wing talk show host, The Lionel Show, we know where they stand. Young Turks. Who's calling it down the middle? Who's having on both Rick Santorum and Harold Ford Jr.? Who, again, Imus was able to really kind of call out as being a little bit, hey, why didn't you help me? Why didn't you come to my defense during the Rutgers basketball situation? Called him a snake. I'll let you decide if you agree with that, but a lot of people do. And a lot of people were saying it after the Imus situation. So anyway, Don Imus, tremendous career, loved the hard-hitting questions, and now we've got to find that political bellwether. That's what we're missing today. He was it. And don't think that the power of sports talk radio didn't potentially influence in a major way the 2008 presidential election when they came down on Don Imus. This is Media Watch.